For 3 days, my wife and I couldn't reach either of our children. No calls answered, no texts returned. Nothing but silence from two grown men who had never once gone more than a day without checking in, at minimum, to ask for something. We flew across the country convinced something terrible had happened, only to find them behind a closed apartment door, laughing at a party neither of us had been told about, celebrating an engagement we weren't invited to witness. When my own son opened that door and called me a suffocating burden on his happiness, something in me went quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before. 3 weeks later, both of my children were sitting in my kitchen, financially unraveling, finally understanding exactly how much they'd been standing on a foundation they never once thanked me for building. Before I tell you exactly what I did, and exactly why I don't regret a single part of it, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from, and hit subscribe if you believe love without respect eventually has to find its limits. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 55 years old, and I built a medical equipment supply company from a single delivery van and a small warehouse lease 28 years ago into a business that now employs nearly 200 people across 4 states. I started that company at 27 years old, fresh out of a sales job at a larger medical distributor where I'd learned enough about the industry to recognize an underserved niche, smaller regional hospitals and clinics that larger distributors considered too small to bother courting properly. I remember those first 2 years vividly, driving that delivery van myself most days, sleeping maybe 5 hours a night, Laura handling the books at our kitchen table while pregnant with Evan, both of us betting everything we had on the belief that reliable, personal service to overlooked customers could eventually build something meaningful. It did. By the time Evan turned 10, the company had grown enough that I could finally stop driving deliveries myself. By the time Ryan graduated high school, we'd expanded into 3 additional states, and by the time both boys were through college, Mercer Medical Supply had become one of the most respected independent medical equipment distributors in the entire Midwest. A reputation I'm still quietly proud of every single day I walk into our headquarters. I've always tried to run that company the way I try to run my family, with fairness, with attentiveness, and with the belief that people generally rise to meet the standard of respect you show them. My longtime operations manager, a woman named Deborah, who has been with me for over 20 years, once told me that she'd watched me treat our newest warehouse employee with exactly the same courtesy I extended to our largest hospital clients, and that this consistency, more than any particular business strategy, was what had made people want to stay loyal to Mercer Medical Supply for decades. I mention this only because I think it matters to understanding how genuinely disorienting it was to discover that the same values I'd built an entire company culture around apparently hadn't translated the way I'd hoped into my own household. I remember, in the weeks following that engagement party, sitting in my office one afternoon, and having Deborah notice something was clearly troubling me, something well beyond ordinary business stress. She'd worked closely enough alongside me for 2 decades to read my moods with an accuracy that occasionally unsettled me, and when she gently asked what was wrong, I found myself, uncharacteristically, telling her the entire story, the 3 days of silence, the doorway, Chloe's dismissiveness, the velvet box Laura had cried over. Deborah listened without interrupting, the way she always did during difficult business negotiations. And when I finished, she said something that stayed with me through everything that followed. "Daniel, I've watched you build an entire company on the principle that respect has to flow in both directions, that loyalty isn't something you can demand without earning it yourself first. I don't see why your own children should be exempt from that same principle just because they happen to share your last name." That conversation, more than almost anything else in those difficult early days, helped crystallize something I'd been struggling to fully articulate even to myself. I had spent 28 years building a company culture around mutual respect, precisely because I understood, instinctively, that unconditional generosity, without accountability, tends to breed entitlement rather than gratitude, whether in a warehouse full of employees or in a household full of children. I had simply, somehow, allowed myself to apply that principle everywhere in my life, except the one place it perhaps mattered most. I did not inherit that company. I did not inherit anything, actually. My own father died when I was 6 years old, a helicopter mechanic killed during a training accident, and I grew up watching my mother work 2 jobs to keep our small house in Ohio, understanding from an early age exactly what it feels like to grow up with a hole in your life where a father should have been. I promised myself, long before I ever had children of my own, that if I was fortunate enough to become a father, my children would never once know what it felt like to lack anything I could reasonably provide, whether that meant money, attention, guidance, or simple, unwavering presence. My wife Laura and I have been married for 29 years, and together we raised two sons, Evan, now 32, and Ryan, now 29, giving them, I believe honestly, more advantages and more support than most children could ever hope for. Laura and I met during my second year running the company, back when she worked as a nurse at one of the small regional hospitals that had become one of our earliest loyal clients, and I still remember the particular determination in her voice the first time she called our office to complain, quite forcefully, about a delayed equipment delivery, an encounter that somehow led to dinner, rather than a lost client relationship. Laura left nursing once Evan was born, choosing to manage our household and eventually our company's early bookkeeping from our kitchen table, a partnership that built the foundation of everything Mercer Medical Supply eventually became. Laura has always been, in my eyes, the emotional center of our family, in ways I've never quite managed to be myself. More naturally warm, more instinctively attuned to our sons' moods and needs throughout their childhoods, the parent they gravitated toward for comfort while I remained, admittedly, the parent more associated with providing and problem-solving. I've often wondered, in the weeks since that engagement party, whether this dynamic inadvertently contributed to how our sons came to view us. Laura, as someone whose presence they still valued emotionally, and me, as someone whose primary value had gradually narrowed, in their minds, to what I could provide financially, rather than who I actually was as a father. I think often about the particular unfairness of that dynamic. Having spent nearly 3 decades showing up for every school event I could possibly make time for, around building a company, coaching Ryan's Little League team for 2 full seasons, despite knowing almost nothing about baseball when I started. Sitting up late helping Evan with math homework, I'd genuinely forgotten how to do myself, requiring us both to relearn algebra together at our kitchen table, more nights than either of us probably remembers now. I never wanted to be remembered simply as the man who paid for things. I wanted to be remembered as present, as engaged, as a father who showed up in every meaningful way a father possibly could. Watching that particular hope collapse in a doorway, replaced by a single word, suffocating, was perhaps the most painful part of the entire ordeal. More painful even than the financial betrayal implicit in 3 days of unexplained silence. Private schooling, paid-for college educations at excellent universities, a car for each of them the day they turned 18, and later, as adults, financial support that extended into their careers in ways I never once resented providing. Co-signing apartment leases, guaranteeing small business loans, backing vehicle financing. The kind of quiet, ongoing safety net that allowed both my sons to take career risks and live lifestyles that would have been considerably more precarious without a father willing to stand behind them financially at every turn. I remember, vividly, the day each of them turned 18. Driving them separately to the same dealership where I'd bought Laura's first car years earlier, watching their faces light up as they signed the paperwork for vehicles I'd already arranged to purchase outright, wanting them to start their adult driving lives without the burden of a car payment weighing on their earliest independent decisions. I remember Evan's college graduation, sitting in the audience with Laura, having quietly paid his entire tuition without a single loan between us, feeling a particular, quiet pride watching him walk across that stage debt-free, a gift I'd wanted to give him specifically because I understood, from my own more difficult path through early adulthood, exactly how much easier life becomes when you're not immediately burdened by significant financial obligations the moment you step into it. Evan gravitated toward marketing and business consulting after college, launching his own small consultancy 5 years ago with an ambition I genuinely admired, though the early years of that business required considerably more financial scaffolding than he ever fully acknowledged to himself. Scaffolding I quietly provided, without making him feel indebted or inadequate for needing it. I remember the pride I felt watching him sign his first major client contract, driving out to take him to dinner to celebrate, never once mentioning that the office lease he'd just signed required my personal guarantee behind the scenes, wanting him to feel the full, unqualified pride of that accomplishment, without the complication of understanding exactly how much of the foundation beneath it depended on his father's continued financial backing. I remember, specifically, a difficult stretch during his consultancy's second year, when Evan lost 2 major clients within the same month, and called me late one night, considerably more vulnerable and honest than he typically allowed himself to be, admitting he wasn't sure the business would survive without additional capital he didn't have access to on his own. I wired him the money the following morning without hesitation, and we never discussed it again beyond his brief, genuine thanks at the time. An exchange I'd assumed reflected the kind of quiet, unconditional support any father would want to provide, never once imagining that this same pattern of rescue, repeated enough times across enough different circumstances, might eventually calcify into something Evan came to expect as simply the ordinary background condition of his adult life, rather than the extraordinary act of love it actually represented each time. Ryan took a more conventional corporate path, working his way up through a regional marketing firm, living a comfortable lifestyle that, in hindsight, depended more heavily on my continued financial backing than either of us discussed openly at the time. Ryan had always been the more reserved of my 2 sons, less overtly ambitious than Evan, but quietly capable in his own steady way. And I remember Laura commenting, more than once over the years, that Ryan seemed to carry a kind of low-grade resentment about needing our help at all, preferring, she suspected, to appear entirely self-made, even while depending on exactly the kind of support he seemed embarrassed to acknowledge accepting. I never begrudged either of them this support. I genuinely enjoyed being able to provide it, remembering constantly the childhood I'd had without a father present to offer anything at all, determined that my own sons would never once feel that particular absence. Looking back now, though, I wonder whether that determination, born entirely from love, inadvertently taught both my sons that support of this magnitude was simply an expected baseline of parenthood, rather than the extraordinary, ongoing generosity it actually represented. A distinction that, I understand now, had been quietly widening between us for longer than the events of that single terrible week ever revealed on their own. Laura and I made a point, throughout their childhoods and into their adult years, of visiting regularly, calling often, remaining genuinely involved in their lives in ways that felt, to us, like ordinary loving parenting rather than intrusion. Looking back now, I wonder how much of what felt like closeness to us had already begun, in ways I failed to notice, feeling like something closer to obligation or surveillance to them, a distinction that, I understand now, had been quietly widening between us for longer than the events of that single terrible week ever revealed on their own. I think often now about specific memories from their childhoods that I've turned over repeatedly since everything unfolded, searching for some earlier sign I might have missed. I remember Evan, perhaps 12 years old, complaining once that I called too frequently during his week at summer camp, a comment Laura and I had laughed off at the time, as ordinary preteen embarrassment about parental attention. I remember Ryan, during his college years, occasionally seeming reluctant when I'd suggest visiting his campus, always finding some reasonable excuse, a busy exam schedule, a conflicting commitment, excuses I never once questioned too deeply at the time, assuming they reflected nothing more than the ordinary independence any college student naturally develops. I do not know, even now, whether these small moments represented genuine early signs of the distance that eventually exploded in that doorway, or whether I'm simply reconstructing significance into ordinary childhood behavior with the benefit of painful hindsight. What I do know is that somewhere between those small, easily dismissed moments and the confrontation outside Evan's apartment, a fundamental shift had occurred in how both my sons viewed our involvement in their lives. A shift neither Laura nor I had recognized clearly enough, or perhaps had simply chosen not to recognize, until it could no longer be ignored. I want to be honest about something before I continue this story, because I think it matters to understanding everything that followed. I never once gave that support expecting gratitude in the traditional sense. I never wanted my sons falling over themselves thanking me constantly, and I certainly never wanted them feeling burdened by obligation. What I did want, what I believe any reasonable parent wants, was simply to remain present in their lives, to be treated with basic respect and consideration, the ordinary courtesy any human being deserves from people they've spent decades supporting unconditionally. I did not think, until the events of 3 weeks ago, that this expectation was unreasonable. The silence began, as far as I can pinpoint it, on a Tuesday afternoon. Evan's lease on his downtown apartment, a beautiful high-rise unit in a major city several states from our home in Ohio, was coming up for renewal, and as the guarantor on that lease, a role I'd taken on 2 years earlier, when Evan's income alone didn't quite satisfy the building's requirements. I needed to review and sign several renewal documents the property management company had sent directly to me. I called Evan that Tuesday to confirm a few details before signing, and the call went straight to voicemail. I texted him, mentioning the documents needed his input on a couple of updated terms, and received no response. I assumed, reasonably enough, that he was simply busy. By Wednesday evening, having heard nothing from Evan, and, curiously, nothing from Ryan either, despite a separate unrelated text I'd sent him about an upcoming family visit we'd discussed weeks earlier, Laura and I began to feel the first genuine flutter of concern. Neither of our sons had ever gone more than a day without responding to at least one of us, even during their busiest professional stretches, and the complete silence from both of them simultaneously felt, the longer it stretched, increasingly unlike either of them. Laura called both boys repeatedly that evening, leaving voicemails with a steadily rising note of worry in her voice that I recognized, having heard it only a handful of times in 29 years of marriage, as genuine maternal fear rather than ordinary irritation. By Thursday morning, after nearly 3 full days without a single word from either son, Laura was barely functioning, convinced something had happened to one or both of them, running through every terrible possibility a parent's mind constructs during exactly this kind of unexplained silence. An accident, an illness, something worse neither of us wanted to voice aloud. I called Evan's building management directly, using my guarantor status to at least confirm he hadn't missed any recent rent payments or triggered any concerning notices, information that offered only mild reassurance, without actually resolving the underlying terror of not knowing whether our children were safe. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that Thursday morning, watching Laura pace back and forth across our living room, her phone clutched in her hand, refreshing her messages every few minutes, despite knowing nothing new had come through. I called Evan's workplace, a small consultancy he ran with 2 employees, and reached only voicemail on their general line. The office apparently closed for what I assumed, at the time, might be some kind of planned company outing. I called 2 mutual friends of Ryan's whose numbers I still had from years earlier, both of whom confirmed they hadn't heard from him recently either, though neither seemed particularly alarmed, a detail that, in my growing panic, I registered only distantly rather than as the reassurance it perhaps should have been. I booked flights that same Thursday afternoon, unable to bear another moment of uncertainty, and Laura and I flew out early Friday morning, landing in Evans City by midday, taking a cab directly to his building with nothing but a small overnight bag each, prepared, in our minds, for the possibility of a hospital visit, a crisis intervention, anything except what we actually found waiting behind that apartment door. I remember very little of that flight except Laura's hand gripping mine the entire time, both of us staring silently out the window, running through scenarios neither of us could bring ourselves to say aloud. The particular helpless terror of parents who have raised their children to adulthood, only to discover, in a single unexplained silence, exactly how quickly that terror can return, in full force regardless of how old your children have become. We arrived at Evan's apartment just after 6 that evening, and even from the hallway, we could hear music playing inside, laughter, the unmistakable sound of a celebration in full swing. Laura and I exchanged a confused glance, the fear that had gripped us for 3 days, shifting, briefly, into a strange, cautious relief, wondering if perhaps we'd simply misunderstood something, if this gathering somehow explained the silence in some reasonable way we hadn't yet considered. I knocked firmly, and after a long moment, the music inside lowered slightly before the door finally opened. Evan stood in the doorway, a drink in his hand, wearing an expression that shifted rapidly from surprise to something considerably less welcoming. Behind him, I could see perhaps 20 guests scattered through his apartment, string lights strung across the living room, a banner reading "Congratulations" hanging near the kitchen, champagne flutes catching the light. It took me only a moment to understand what we were looking at. This was an engagement party, and clearly, we had not been invited. "Mom, Dad, what are you doing here?" Evan's voice carried none of the relief I might have expected from a son whose parents had spent 3 sleepless days fearing the worst about his safety. If anything, his tone carried something closer to irritation, the particular frustration of someone caught doing something they'd deliberately hidden. Laura, still processing the shift from terror to confusion, stepped forward and asked, her voice shaking slightly, why he hadn't answered any of our calls for 3 days, explaining, through tears she could no longer hold back, how frightened we'd been, how we'd flown across the country genuinely believing something terrible had happened to him. Evan's response landed like a physical blow. Look, I love you guys, but you're kind of suffocating, you know? I needed some space to plan this without you two hovering over every single detail like you always do. He said it casually, almost dismissively, as though explaining an obvious, reasonable decision, rather than acknowledging the genuine terror he'd put his parents through over 3 days of complete, unexplained silence. Ryan appeared behind his brother a moment later, and rather than offering any comfort or explanation, he simply confirmed, with an ease that suggested this was a shared, long-held sentiment, rather than a heat-of-the-moment reaction, that he too had been deliberately choosing distance from us for years. Honestly, that's part of why I moved to a different city than either of you, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. It's easier when there's some actual space between us. You guys mean well, but it's a lot. Always checking in, always needing to know everything. A young woman I didn't recognize appeared beside Evan then, clearly his fiancée, wearing an engagement ring I hadn't yet had the chance to properly notice given everything else unfolding. I would learn over the following weeks that Chloe came from a wealthy family in the same city, her father a prominent commercial real estate developer, her upbringing one of considerable comfort, and, I gathered from small details Evan let slip over subsequent months, considerable emotional distance from her own parents, despite that material comfort. I mention this not to excuse her behavior in that doorway, but because I think it matters to understanding the particular dynamic that had apparently developed between her and my sons, a shared, unspoken agreement that parents existed primarily as a resource to be managed carefully, rather than a genuine, ongoing presence worth actively maintaining. You must be Evan's parents, she said, though her tone carried no warmth at all. I have to be honest, this is really not okay. You can't just show up uninvited and make a scene at our engagement party. This night was supposed to be special, and now it's kind of ruined. Her name, I would learn moments later, was Chloe, and her casual cruelty in that moment, treating 2 frightened, exhausted parents as unwelcome intruders, rather than people who had just spent 3 days believing their children might be dead, struck me with a force I still find difficult to fully articulate. I remember noticing, even in that heightened, painful moment, that Chloe never once asked why we'd come, never once paused to consider that 2 people wouldn't fly across the country unannounced without a genuinely urgent reason driving them. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue, did not demand an apology, did not do any of the things I imagine a less controlled version of myself might have done in that doorway. I simply looked at my 2 sons, standing there in a hallway filled with music and laughter that suddenly felt very far away, and I understood, with a clarity that settled over me like something cold and final, that the silence of those 3 days had not been an accident, an oversight, or a simple failure of communication. It had been a choice, made deliberately by both of my children, to exclude us entirely from a moment they knew mattered to us, and to let us suffer through days of genuine terror, rather than send a single text confirming they were simply alive and celebrating without us. I studied Chloe for a moment, this young woman I was meeting for the first time under circumstances I never could have anticipated, standing confidently in the doorway of an apartment my own guarantee had helped secure, wearing a ring Laura had once dreamed of replacing with a family heirloom passed down with love and ceremony. I understood, watching her speak so easily about how we'd ruined her evening, that whatever version of Evan and Ryan she had come to know, it was clearly one comfortable enough in its own entitlement, that treating parents who'd flown across the country in genuine terror as an inconvenience felt, to her, like a perfectly reasonable response, rather than something requiring even basic tact. Behind Evan and Chloe, I could see several of the party guests glancing toward the doorway, clearly aware something uncomfortable was unfolding, a few of them quietly stepping back to give the confrontation space while pretending not to watch too closely. I felt, standing there, a peculiar kind of dignity settle over me, understanding that whatever happened next, I refused to become the kind of parent who begged for inclusion, who groveled for an invitation to a celebration my own children had deliberately withheld from me. I told Evan and Ryan, quietly, that I hoped they had a wonderful evening, and I took Laura's hand and walked back toward the elevator without another word. Laura cried the entire ride down, and I held her, my own emotions locked somewhere deep beneath a composure I wasn't entirely sure how I was maintaining. We checked into a hotel near the airport that night, rather than staying anywhere connected to either of our sons, and neither of us slept more than an hour or two. I remember lying awake in that hotel room well past 2 in the morning, Laura finally asleep beside me, after hours of quiet crying, replaying the entire encounter in my mind, searching for some detail I might have misunderstood, some context that might make Evan's words feel less like a deliberate rejection and more like an unfortunate misunderstanding, born of stress and poor timing. I could not find that context, no matter how many times I turned the evening over in my mind. My son had called us suffocating. My other son had confirmed he'd deliberately built distance between us for years. And the woman about to become part of our family had treated our genuine terror over 3 days of silence as nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to her celebration. I remember, the following morning, sitting across from Laura at a small diner near our hotel, both of us barely touching the breakfast in front of us, when she finally spoke the thought that had apparently been forming in her mind through her own sleepless night. "Daniel, I keep thinking about how we would have found out if something actually had happened to one of them. Some accident. Something we should have known about immediately. Would we have even known? Or would we have found out days later? The same way we'd have found out about this engagement, simply because we happened to show up uninvited." I did not have a good answer for her that morning, and the question stayed with me, uncomfortably, through the entire flight home, through the following days, through everything that eventually led me to Martin's office. The following morning, I called Martin Cole, my company's longtime attorney and a close personal friend for nearly 2 decades, and asked him to meet me at my office as early as his schedule allowed. Martin had handled most of my company's legal affairs since its earliest years, and had, in that time, also assisted with several personal financial matters, including, as it happened, the guarantor agreements I'd signed on behalf of both my sons over the years. He arrived within the hour, and I explained everything that had happened: the 3 days of silence, the engagement party, the doorway confrontation, watching his expression shift from professional attentiveness to genuine personal concern, as I described exactly how our sons had spoken to us. Martin had known Evan and Ryan since they were teenagers, having attended more than one family barbecue over the years, and I could see, watching his face as I recounted the doorway confrontation, that this wasn't simply a client describing a legal matter to him. This was a friend genuinely troubled by what he was hearing. "Daniel," he said quietly, once I'd finished, "I've got 2 kids of my own, and I can't imagine either of them ever speaking to me the way you're describing. I'm sorry you and Laura went through that." His personal sympathy, more than almost anything else in those difficult days, helped me feel less alone in believing my reaction to everything that followed was reasonable rather than excessive. It was back at our own house in Ohio, 2 days after our return from that trip, unpacking the small overnight bag I'd hastily packed before our flight, that I found Laura sitting on the edge of our bed, quietly crying, holding a small velvet box in her hands. I sat beside her and asked what she was holding, and she opened it to reveal my grandmother's engagement ring, a delicate antique piece Laura had kept safely stored for years, dreaming, she told me through tears, of the day she would present it to whichever woman one of our sons eventually chose to marry. A piece of family history she'd hoped to pass down with love and ceremony, rather than simply mail off or forget about entirely. Laura told me, sitting there on the edge of our bed, that she'd actually taken that ring to a local jeweler roughly a year earlier, quietly having it professionally cleaned, and the setting reinforced, anticipating exactly this kind of moment, imagining herself sitting down with whichever future daughter-in-law our sons brought home, telling her the story of my grandmother, a woman who had worn that ring for nearly 50 years of her own marriage, explaining how meaningful it would be to see it continue its journey through our family. "I had this whole moment planned in my head, Daniel," she said, her voice cracking. "I was going to tell her about your grandmother, about how she raised 5 children through the Depression wearing this same ring, about how much it would mean to our family to see her wear it too. And instead, we weren't even invited to know Chloe existed until she was already insulting us in a doorway. I was going to give this to Chloe," she told me, her voice breaking. "I've been planning exactly how I'd present it to her for months, imagining how special that moment would be. And instead, We weren't even invited to know she existed, until she was already insulting us in a doorway. Watching my wife cry over that small velvet box, understanding everything it represented, the years of love and anticipation now curdled into grief, over a relationship that had apparently already decided we mattered so little, we didn't even warrant an invitation to witness its most significant milestone. Something inside me shifted permanently. I had spent 29 years giving my sons every material and emotional advantage I could provide, believing, perhaps naively, that this generosity would naturally translate into a relationship built on mutual respect and genuine care. Watching Laura cry over that ring, I understood, finally and completely, that generosity without reciprocated respect simply becomes something to be exploited rather than appreciated. The following morning, I called Martin Cole again, this time to begin formally addressing the financial side of everything that had happened. "Daniel," he said once I'd finished, "I've known you a long time, and I've watched you support those boys in ways that frankly go well beyond what most parents would even consider reasonable. What exactly are you looking to do here?" I told him, calmly and without hesitation, that I wanted to formally withdraw as guarantor on Evan's apartment lease, effective immediately, and that I wanted him to review every other financial obligation I currently held on behalf of either son, business loan guarantees, vehicle financing co-signatures, any remaining commitments where my name and my financial standing were being used to support their independent adult lives. Martin pulled up the relevant documentation on his laptop, and together we spent nearly 2 hours identifying the full scope of what I'd been quietly backing for years, without ever fully cataloging it in one place. Evan's apartment lease, which required my guarantee to satisfy the building's income requirements, representing a monthly rent obligation of nearly $4,000, I had been standing behind for 2 years. A business loan Evan had taken out 18 months earlier to expand his small marketing consultancy, which I had personally guaranteed after the bank expressed hesitation about his limited credit history. A loan with an outstanding balance, still north of $90,000. Ryan's vehicle financing on a luxury car he'd purchased 2 years earlier, again requiring my guarantee due to his income at the time falling short of the lender's independent requirements. A remaining balance of roughly $55,000. Seeing it all laid out together, the true scope of exactly how much of my son's comfortable adult lives depended entirely on financial infrastructure I had quietly provided without ever making a point of it, was, honestly, more sobering than I expected. "Daniel, I want to make sure you understand something," Martin said, closing his laptop briefly to look at me directly. "This isn't a small gesture you're considering undoing. Between the two of them, you're talking about withdrawing backing on close to $150,000 in combined obligations. That's not pocket change, even for a man in your position. Are you prepared for how significant the fallout might actually be?" I told him I understood completely, that I had spent the entire flight home, and the following sleepless nights, already turning over exactly this question, and that my answer had not changed. I wanted every single guarantee withdrawn. "I want all of it withdrawn, Martin," I told him. "Every guarantee, every co-signature, everything with my name attached that isn't legally locked in beyond my ability to remove it. I'm not trying to hurt them. I'm simply done being a safety net for 2 adults who've made it clear they'd rather I not exist in their lives at all, except when my signature happens to be useful to them." Martin, to his credit, asked me carefully whether I was certain I wanted to proceed, reminding me that withdrawing these guarantees would likely create genuine, immediate financial consequences for both my sons. Consequences that couldn't be easily walked back once formally processed with the relevant banks and property management companies. I told him I understood completely, and that I had never been more certain of a decision in my life. Within the week, Martin had formally processed the withdrawal of my guarantee on Evan's apartment lease, along with the business loan guarantee and Ryan's vehicle financing co-signature, sending formal written notice to each relevant institution that I would no longer be standing behind these financial obligations moving forward. The consequences unfolded quickly. Evan's property management company, upon receiving formal notice that his lease guarantee had been withdrawn, informed him that his upcoming renewal could not proceed under the original terms, and that without an alternative qualified guarantor or a significant increase in demonstrated independent income, the lease would not be renewed at all. Evan called me within days of receiving that notice, his tone considerably different from the dismissive irritation I'd encountered in his doorway weeks earlier, though I noted, even in his panic, that his opening words focused entirely on his own predicament, rather than any acknowledgement of what had prompted my decision. "Dad, what is going on with my lease? They're saying you pulled your guarantee. This has to be some kind of mistake, right? I have less than 60 days to figure this out." The business loan guarantee proved even more consequential for Evan than the apartment lease. His bank, upon receiving formal withdrawal of my guarantee, conducted an immediate reassessment of his consultancy's outstanding loan balance, and given the business's still developing revenue history, flagged the account for accelerated repayment review. Evan spent several frantic weeks, he later told me, meeting with the bank directly, presenting updated financial projections, and ultimately negotiating a restructured repayment plan at less favorable terms than his original loan. A process he described, with visible exhaustion, as the most stressful professional experience of his entire career, considerably more difficult than anything he'd navigated during the consultancy's actual founding years when I'd quietly stood behind him the entire time. I explained, calmly, that it was not a mistake, that I had made a deliberate decision following the events of our visit, and that I felt it was time for him to manage his own financial obligations independently, exactly as an adult his age should reasonably be expected to. He argued, initially, that this was an overreaction, that our disagreement in the doorway had simply been a stressful moment that shouldn't translate into what he called punishing him financially. I told him, without raising my voice, that I wasn't punishing him. I was simply respecting the independence he and his brother had made so clear they wanted from us. Ryan's situation unfolded similarly. His vehicle lender, upon receiving formal notice of my withdrawn co-signature, informed him that his existing financing terms could not continue without an alternative qualified co-signer, triggering a formal review of his loan that ultimately required him to either refinance at considerably higher rates reflecting his independent creditworthiness, or surrender the vehicle entirely. Ryan called me nearly a week after Evan, his tone carrying the particular defensiveness of someone who had clearly discussed the situation extensively with his brother, before working up the nerve to call, "Dad, this is really messing up my life right now. I can't just come up with the money to refinance at these new rates. Can we talk about this?" I remember that particular call vividly, because Ryan, unlike Evan's initial reaction, seemed genuinely bewildered rather than simply frustrated, as though the concept of financial independence had never fully registered as something he might actually need to navigate on his own someday. He mentioned, at one point during that call, that he'd never actually calculated what his monthly expenses would look like without my quiet backing, admitting, with what sounded like genuine shock, that the numbers were considerably higher than he'd realized, having simply absorbed a comfortable lifestyle for years without examining how much of its foundation depended on decisions I'd made on his behalf. I found myself feeling, during that call, less anger than a kind of sad clarity, understanding that Ryan's situation reflected less deliberate entitlement than simple, comfortable unawareness. A distinction that mattered to me, even as I maintained my resolve not to restore the guarantee. Ultimately, Ryan sold the vehicle rather than absorb the higher refinancing rates, purchasing a considerably more modest used car with cash he'd saved, a decision that, months later, he actually described to me as one of the more clarifying financial choices he'd ever made, forcing him to properly understand his own income and expenses for what he admitted was essentially the first time in his adult life. I told both my sons, separately, the same thing. I was willing to talk, always, about rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. I was not willing to simply restore financial support that had, apparently, become something they felt entitled to rather than something they appreciated as the genuine gift it had always been intended to be. Over the following several weeks, I watched, from a careful distance, as both my sons navigated real financial consequences for what felt, to them I'm sure, like the first time in their adult lives, the genuine, unmitigated weight of independence they had claimed to want so badly standing in that doorway. I learned, through a conversation Laura had with Evan weeks later, that Chloe's reaction to the sudden financial upheaval had been considerably less patient than either of our sons might have hoped. According to what Evan eventually shared, Chloe had grown increasingly frustrated as their wedding planning stalled amid the scramble to find new housing and stabilize Evan's business finances, at one point apparently suggesting, with a bluntness that must have stung considering the source, that Evan should simply fix things with his parents, rather than let pride get in the way of restoring what she referred to as their previous quality of life. Evan told Laura, during that particular conversation, that Chloe had grown increasingly vocal about her frustration over the following weeks, at one point comparing their sudden financial constraints unfavorably to a wedding one of her college friends had recently thrown, suggesting Evan needed to figure out a way to make this work, without ever once acknowledging her own role in the doorway confrontation that had precipitated everything. I felt, hearing this second-hand account, a complicated mixture of vindication and genuine sadness, understanding that the same entitled dismissiveness Chloe had shown us in that doorway was apparently now being turned, in a smaller way, against my own son, once the convenient financial cushion beneath their relationship began to wobble. I do not know whether Evan ever fully connected the dots between Chloe's reaction and her own earlier behavior toward us. If he did, he never mentioned it directly, though I noticed, in the months that followed, a subtle shift in how he spoke about Chloe during our increasingly frequent phone calls. Less uncritical admiration, more of the ordinary, grounded assessment that comes from watching someone reveal their character under genuine pressure, rather than during the easy, celebratory moments that had defined their relationship up to that point. Roughly a month after that engagement party, Evan called and asked whether he and Ryan could come visit us in Ohio, together, to talk things through properly. Laura and I agreed, and the following weekend, both our sons arrived at the family home where they'd grown up, looking noticeably more tired and considerably less certain of themselves than the confident young men we'd encountered in that apartment doorway a month earlier. I remember watching them pull into our driveway that Saturday afternoon, both driving separately, arriving within minutes of each other, in a way that suggested careful advance coordination rather than coincidence. Laura had spent the morning preparing dinner, the same pot roast recipe she'd made countless times throughout their childhoods, and I remember the strange, dissonant quality of that familiar smell filling our kitchen, while both of us braced ourselves for a conversation neither of us particularly looked forward to having. We sat, all four of us, around the same kitchen table where Evan and Ryan had once done their childhood homework, where Laura and I had once discussed the earliest years of the business, a table that had witnessed nearly every significant conversation our family had ever had. The conversation, at first, did not go the way I had hoped it might. Evan opened by describing, at some length, the stress of losing his apartment lease, the difficulty of finding a new place on short notice, the embarrassment of explaining to Chloe why they suddenly needed to relocate before their wedding planning had even properly begun. Ryan followed with his own account of the financial strain from refinancing his vehicle at a dramatically higher interest rate, describing it as unfair, as an overreaction to what he continued characterizing as simply an emotional evening that had gotten out of hand. I listened to both of them for nearly 20 minutes, noting, with a certain quiet sadness, that neither of them had yet said a single word acknowledging the actual substance of what had prompted this entire situation. The 3 days of terrifying silence, the doorway confrontation, Chloe's casual cruelty toward two exhausted, frightened parents. When they finally finished describing their own hardships, I asked them both, directly, whether either of them understood why I had made the decisions I made. Evan hesitated, then offered something closer to an actual apology, acknowledging that ignoring our calls for 3 days had probably been not great, though he still framed the engagement party secrecy as something he'd been entitled to plan privately without our involvement. Ryan, to his credit, seemed to reach a somewhat deeper understanding, admitting quietly that he'd never actually considered how frightening 3 days of complete silence might have felt from our side, having been so focused on maintaining what he called space, that he hadn't stopped to consider the fear that silence might create in people who loved him. I told them both, calmly and without any bitterness I could detect in my own voice, exactly what I had come to understand over the preceding month. You told us, clearly and directly, standing in that doorway, that you wanted independence, that you wanted space, that our presence in your lives felt suffocating, rather than supportive. I simply decided to respect that request completely, rather than continuing to provide financial support while you told me, in the same breath, that my involvement in your lives was unwelcome. You can't have it both ways, boys. You can't ask me to disappear emotionally while still expecting me to remain fully present financially. I chose to give you exactly what you said you wanted. Laura spoke then, her voice steady in a way that told me she had been preparing these words carefully. Your father and I have spent 29 years building a family we hoped would stay close, because you wanted to be close, not because you needed our money to stay comfortable. Watching you tell us we were suffocating you, while never once considering how frightened 3 days of silence made us, was one of the hardest moments of my entire life. I support your father completely in everything he's done since that night. Completely. I watched both my sons absorb Laura's words, understanding, I think for the first time, that this was not a temporary reaction. They could simply wait out until we softened and quietly restored the previous arrangement. I want to describe honestly the particular quality of silence that followed Laura's statement. Both our sons sitting across from us at the same kitchen table where they'd once done their childhood homework, absorbing, apparently for the first time, that their parents' response to that doorway confrontation was not a temporary punishment they could wait out, but a genuine, permanent recalibration of how our family would operate going forward. Ryan, I noticed, seemed to age slightly in his seat, the reality of the situation settling over him in a way that felt different from his earlier defensiveness about the vehicle financing. Evan reached across the table at one point, seemingly wanting to take Laura's hand, and I watched her allow it while making clear, through her posture, that this gesture alone would not undo weeks of careful, deliberate decision-making on our part. I asked both my sons, directly, a question I'd been turning over in my own mind for weeks. When exactly did our involvement in your lives start feeling like a burden rather than a support? I need to understand that, honestly, if we're going to rebuild anything real between us. Evan was quiet for a long moment before admitting, with visible difficulty, that he thought it had started roughly 2 years earlier, around the time he'd begun dating Chloe, whose own more distant relationship with her parents had somehow become, without his fully realizing it, a kind of unspoken model he'd started measuring our own closeness against, wondering whether our frequent calls and visits represented something unusual rather than simply ordinary parental love. Ryan's answer surprised me more. He admitted that his own growing distance had less to do with any specific grievance, and more to do with a kind of quiet insecurity he'd carried since college. A sense that he'd never quite matched Evan's more visible ambitions, and that maintaining physical distance from us had felt, somehow, like a way of avoiding constant comparison, rather than any genuine desire to push us away. Hearing that, I felt something soften slightly in my chest, understanding that at least part of what had driven Ryan's behavior wasn't entitlement so much as an unaddressed insecurity Laura and I had apparently never noticed clearly enough to address directly over the years. Evan asked, somewhat desperately, whether there was anything they could do to repair things, to have the guarantees restored. And I told him honestly that the guarantees were not coming back, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I genuinely believed both my sons needed to build their adult lives on their own independent foundation rather than one quietly propped up by a father they'd made clear they found burdensome. I told him that our relationship, however, was a separate matter entirely, one I remained fully willing to rebuild, provided it was built on genuine mutual respect, rather than the transactional convenience it had apparently become. In the months that followed that difficult conversation, I made a decision that I had actually been quietly contemplating since the night Laura showed me that small velvet box, a decision that felt, once I finally acted on it, like closing a particular chapter of my life while opening something considerably more meaningful. I made this decision, if I'm honest, thinking constantly about my own father, a man I barely remember, except through a handful of photographs, and my mother's careful, loving stories. A helicopter mechanic who died in a training accident when I was only 6 years old, leaving my mother to work 2 jobs and raise me largely alone. I have exactly one clear memory of him, sitting on his shoulders at a county fair, his laugh rumbling up through his chest as we watched fireworks over a lake. A memory so faded and fragmentary that I've sometimes wondered, over the years, whether I actually remember it, or whether I've simply reconstructed it so many times from my mother's retelling that it now feels like my own. My mother kept a small folded flag in a glass case on our living room mantel throughout my entire childhood. A presence in our home that reminded me daily, without either of us needing to say much about it, exactly what my father's service and sacrifice had cost our family. I remember, as a teenager, occasionally attending memorial services for other fallen service members alongside my mother, watching other families experience the same particular grief ours had known, and noticing, even then, how differently those families' circumstances varied, depending on whether they had access to adequate financial support in the aftermath. Some families managed reasonably well, whether through military benefits, community support, or simply better financial circumstances to begin with. Others struggled visibly, children forced to abandon college plans, families losing homes, the kind of secondary loss that compounds an already devastating primary loss, in ways that always struck me, even as a young man, as a particular injustice worth addressing if I ever found myself in a position to do so. I grew up understanding, in a way children who haven't experienced it rarely can, exactly what it means to carry a father-shaped absence through an entire childhood, wondering constantly what advice he might have given, what pride he might have felt, what ordinary, everyday presence I would never get to experience. I remember specific moments throughout my life, my high school graduation, my wedding day, the birth of both my sons, where I felt his absence most acutely, wishing desperately for even a few minutes of his presence to share in what should have been ordinary family milestones. I promised myself, decades ago, long before Evan or Ryan were even born, that if I ever achieved any real success in life, I would find a way to make sure other children carrying that same specific grief, children who had lost a parent to military service exactly as I had, would never have to face that absence without at least the security of knowing their education and their future remained protected. I met with Martin again, this time to formally restructure our family's estate and financial legacy planning, working through the specific mechanics of the foundation over several careful weeks. Under the new arrangement, everything Laura and I have built together passes first and entirely to whichever of us survives the other, exactly as any reasonable estate plan would provide. But beyond that, should Laura and I both pass, the significant majority of our estate, rather than passing directly and unconditionally to our sons, would instead fund a scholarship foundation supporting the children of service members who died in the line of duty, ensuring that young people who had lost a parent to military service would have access to the kind of educational opportunities and financial stability I had worked my entire life to be able to offer. Martin and I spent considerable time working through the specific structure of the foundation, ultimately settling on a model that would provide full 4-year college scholarships to roughly 15 students annually, selected through an application process that would prioritize academic merit alongside genuine financial need, administered by a small board that would include Martin himself, Deborah from my company, and a representative from a veterans support organization I'd quietly donated to for years, without ever making much public mention of it. I found, working through those details with Martin, a genuine sense of purpose and clarity that had been noticeably absent from the more painful conversations surrounding my own sons in recent months. A reminder that the impulse toward generosity that had defined so much of my parenting had never actually been the problem. The problem had simply been directing that generosity toward people who had stopped recognizing it as a gift rather than an entitlement. I named the foundation after my father, the Robert Mercer Memorial Scholarship, the first time in my adult life I had used his actual name for anything significant, having spent so many years referring to him simply as my father in conversation, as though using his given name might somehow presume a familiarity I never actually had the chance to earn with him. Writing his name on that founding document felt, unexpectedly, like one of the more emotionally significant moments of the entire ordeal, a way of finally giving him a presence in my adult life that circumstance had denied him the chance to have himself. Evan and Ryan will still receive a modest, meaningful inheritance under the new arrangement. Enough, I believe, to reflect 29 years of genuine love, but no longer the kind of unlimited, unconditional financial safety net that had apparently allowed them to take our presence in their lives so completely for granted. I explained this decision to both of them honestly, without anger, simply as the natural continuation of everything I had already begun putting into practice. And though the conversation was difficult, I watched, in the months that followed, something begin to shift genuinely in how both my sons approached our relationship. Less transactional, more careful, more attentive in ways that felt, slowly but unmistakably, like the beginning of an actual repair rather than a performance, staged simply to restore financial convenience. Laura and I sat on our back porch a few weeks ago, watching the sun go down over the same Ohio backyard where our sons grew up climbing trees and playing catch, with a father who never once imagined, back then, that a night would come when they'd call his presence in their lives suffocating. Laura reached over and took my hand, the same way she had 100 times over 29 years of marriage, and neither of us needed to say very much. We had both arrived, separately and together, at the same quiet understanding. I noticed, that particular evening, the old swing set still standing at the far edge of our yard, rusted now, unused for over 2 decades, that I'd built myself the summer Evan turned 4, spending an entire weekend with a manual and a pile of lumber, determined to give my sons exactly the kind of ordinary, hands-on father I'd never had the chance to know myself. I remember pushing both boys on that swing for what felt like hundreds of afternoons, Laura calling us in for dinner as the light faded. An ordinary, unremarkable happiness that I never once imagined would eventually feel, in hindsight, like the peak of something, rather than simply the beginning of an ongoing relationship built to last a lifetime. I've thought more than once since that engagement party about mentioning to Laura that we should finally take that old swing set down, given how many years it's sat unused, rusting quietly at the edge of our property. I haven't been able to bring myself to do it. There's something about its presence, weathered and neglected as it's become, that still represents the version of fatherhood I gave everything to build, even if the sons who once swung on it have grown into men who, at least for one difficult period, seem to have forgotten how much that version of fatherhood had actually meant. I like to think, watching Ryan's genuine growth over these past months, that perhaps that old swing set still means something to at least one of them too, even if neither of us has said so directly. I think, watching that sunset, about my own father, about the 6 short years I had with him, and about how differently my own children have chosen to treat the abundance of years they've had with theirs. I think about the small velvet box Laura once cried over, about a ring meant to symbolize love, passed carefully from one generation to the next, and about how close I came to letting that symbol of love be handed carelessly to people who had already decided we mattered too little to even receive an invitation. I do not regret a single decision I made in the weeks that followed that engagement party. I regret only that it took a doorway confrontation and my wife's tears over a small velvet box to finally understand something I should perhaps have recognized far sooner. Sometimes, the greatest act of love a parent can offer isn't relentless, unconditional giving that asks nothing in return, no matter how deeply that giving is meant. Sometimes, it's simply stepping back, remembering your own worth, and trusting that anyone who truly values your presence will find their way back to it once the chasing finally stops. That, more than any amount of money I've ever earned, or any business I've ever built, is the lesson I hope my sons, and anyone watching this story, ultimately carries forward. I think, too, about all the parents out there who might be watching this story, recognizing pieces of their own family in it, the quiet, creeping sense that your generosity has somehow stopped being appreciated and started simply being expected, the particular loneliness of loving people who seem to have forgotten you're a person too, with your own needs, your own worth, your own limits. I want to tell you, if that's you watching this right now, that stepping back is not the same thing as giving up. It is not cruelty, and it is not punishment. It is simply the recognition that love without any reciprocal respect eventually stops being love and starts being something closer to servitude, and that recognizing that difference, however painful it feels in the moment, is one of the most important things a parent can ever learn to do for themselves. Evan and Chloe did eventually marry, roughly 8 months after that difficult reconciliation dinner in our kitchen, in a considerably smaller, more modest ceremony than the extravagant plans they'd originally discussed, before the financial realities of independent adult life set in fully. Laura and I attended, invited properly this time, and I watched, with a cautious but genuine hope, my son exchange vows with a woman who seemed, in the months since we'd first met her in that doorway, to have softened considerably, whether through genuine growth or simply the humbling experience of watching wedding plans scale back to match reality rather than expectation. Chloe approached me privately during the reception, somewhat awkwardly, and offered what I recognized as a genuine, if imperfect, attempt at an apology, acknowledging that she'd behaved poorly that night and that she understood now, having watched Evan navigate real financial independence for the first time, exactly how much we'd actually been quietly providing all along. I accepted her apology graciously, understanding that genuine growth, however belated, still deserves acknowledgement rather than continued resentment. I do not know, even now, whether that softening will prove lasting. I know only that I no longer feel obligated to fund a lifestyle simply to avoid finding out. Ryan, for his part, has grown noticeably more communicative in the months since that difficult kitchen conversation, calling more frequently, not out of any financial necessity now that his situation has stabilized on its own independent footing, but seemingly out of a genuine, rebuilding desire to maintain closeness with people he seems to have finally recognized he'd taken too much for granted. He mentioned to me recently, almost offhandedly during a phone call about nothing in particular, that he hoped, someday, to have children of his own who understood the value of family the way he felt he'd finally begun to understand it himself. A comment that struck me as one of the more meaningful things either of my sons has said to me in years. I remember, specifically, a conversation Ryan and I had roughly 6 months after that difficult kitchen dinner, sitting together on our back porch during one of his now more frequent visits, when he told me, with a candor I hadn't heard from him in years, that selling the luxury vehicle and settling into a more modest lifestyle had actually clarified something important for him about the kind of adult he actually wanted to become, separate from the version of success he'd inherited, without much genuine reflection, from watching his older brothers' more visible ambitions throughout their childhoods. "I think I was just kind of coasting on what everyone expected, Dad," he told me. "Having to actually build things myself, even something as small as figuring out my own budget, made me feel like I was finally living my own life, instead of just the comfortable version you and Mom had built for me." Hearing him say that, more than almost anything else in the months since that engagement party, gave me a genuine confidence that the difficult decisions I'd made had ultimately served their intended purpose. I still hope, someday, to watch both my sons build the kind of close, respectful relationship with their own children that I always intended to build with mine, one grounded not in unlimited financial rescue, but in the kind of genuine presence and mutual respect that money alone was never actually capable of purchasing, no matter how much of it I once quietly offered, without asking anything meaningful in return. If this story meant something to you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe love without respect eventually has to find its limits, hit subscribe to Humble Dad Stories. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you.